The hospital room was stark and silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Rachel Blythe, only 32 but appearing much older due to her gaunt features and pallid complexion, sat up in her hospital bed, her fragile hands clutching the edge of the blanket. She gazed out the window, where the grey skies of London mirrored the storm brewing in her soul. The chill in the room was nothing compared to the icy demeanor of the man standing at the foot of her bed. Ethan Moore, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, adjusted his cufflinks with a precision that spoke volumes of his personality. At 35, he exuded confidence, charm, and the kind of detachment that often left people questioning his humanity. Today, however, his calculated demeanor served a purpose. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "but this isn't something I can handle. It's too much." Rachel's lips trembled, though she refused to let tears fall in his presence. Her once vivid green eyes now seemed dulled, almost glassy, as if her illness had stripped away the vibrancy of the artist she once was. She had fought hard to stay strong through months of chemotherapy, but nothing could prepare her for the words Ethan had just spoken. "I need you to understand," Ethan continued, his gaze shifting to the minimalist clock on the wall, as though counting the seconds until he could leave. "This isn't about you. It's about me, my life, my work, your convenience," Rachel interjected weakly, her voice soft, but cutting through the silence like glass shattering. "Your precious, untouchable life. How could I have been so blind?" Ethan stiffened but said nothing. The truth was, he had weighed his options. Staying by Rachel's side meant watching her fade away, enduring sleepless nights, and putting his career, the one thing he valued above all else, on hold. Logic, as he framed it, dictated his decision. "I've arranged for the best private care," Ethan said, as if that could excuse the betrayal etched on Rachel's face. "You won't want for anything." "Except a husband," she whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned away, unable or unwilling to face her anymore. As he walked to the door, his polished shoes clicking against the sterile floor, Rachel spoke again, her voice faint yet heavy with resolve. "I don't need your pity, Ethan, but someday you'll need someone's forgiveness, and you won't find it as easily as you think." For the first time, Ethan hesitated. He stopped mid-stride but didn't turn around. A faint sigh escaped his lips before he opened the door and left without a glance back. Rachel sank against the pillows, the strength she'd mustered to confront him now evaporated. The room felt impossibly vast and suffocating all at once. The realization hit her with brutal clarity. She was alone, not just in this hospital but in the battle ahead. Outside, Ethan strode briskly down the hallway, his phone already in hand as he dialed his assistant. His life awaited him. Meetings, deals, a carefully curated image of success. He reassured himself that leaving Rachel was the pragmatic choice. He had obligations, responsibilities that didn't include lingering in the shadow of her illness. Yet, as the hospital doors closed behind him and the rain began to fall, a nagging unease settled in his chest. Ethan dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue. After all, he reasoned, emotions were fleeting, and logic always prevailed. But the world had a way of testing even the most steadfast convictions, and Ethan Moore, for all his meticulous planning, was about to learn that life cared little for his logic. The steady hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights seemed to match the rhythm of Rachel's shallow breathing. The room was silent again, save for the occasional shuffle of a nurse passing by the doorway. Rachel Blythe's hands trembled as she reached for her sketchbook, one of the few belongings she had asked to be brought from home. It rested on the nightstand, untouched for weeks. The once vibrant pages of sketches, Studies of London's iconic architecture and heartfelt portraits of strangers she encountered on the streets now felt like relics of another life, a life she feared she had lost entirely. She flipped through the pages, her fingers pausing on a sketch she had made 5 years ago. It was of Ethan, seated on a park bench during their honeymoon in Paris. His face, relaxed and smiling, was almost unrecognizable compared to the man who had walked out on her hours ago. Back then, Ethan had been different, or so she had believed. Rachel closed her eyes and let the memories pull her back, past the cold present to the warmth of their beginning. They had met at an art gallery opening in London. Rachel, a burgeoning artist in her late 20s, had been showcasing her work for the first time. Her father, Thomas Blythe, a titan of British industry and philanthropy, had orchestrated the event to highlight emerging talents. Ethan Moore had arrived as a guest, a rising entrepreneur eager to network with the city's elite. Rachel had noticed him immediately. His presence was magnetic, not because of his sharp suit or charming smile, but because of the way he had lingered in front of her paintings. Unlike most attendees who admired the art as a polite gesture before moving on to the champagne table, Ethan had studied her pieces with genuine curiosity. "You see the world differently," he had said, stopping beside her. His voice had been smooth, confident. "This one, Reflections in Regent's Park. It's vulnerable, almost painfully so. It's as if you're showing the world a part of yourself you'd rather keep hidden." Rachel had been taken aback by his observation. "Art isn't about hiding," she had replied, the corners of her mouth curving into a smile. "It's about revealing what words can't express." That night, they had talked for hours, their connection immediate and electric. Ethan had been captivated by her passion and talent, and Rachel, in turn, had been drawn to his ambition and vision. Within months, they were inseparable. He proposed on the terrace of her father's estate, under a sky full of stars. And for a time, Rachel believed she had found a man who cherished not only her art but her very essence. But over the years, cracks had begun to form in the foundation of their marriage. Ethan's relentless drive for success had consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. The once intimate conversations about life and dreams were replaced by terse exchanges about schedules and obligations. Rachel's illness had only widened the chasm between them. Her father, Thomas Blythe, had been a steady presence during those early, grueling months of treatment. Despite his wealth and influence, he had remained a humble and loving father, often bringing her soups he'd made himself or sitting by her side, reading aloud from her favorite novels. It had been his unwavering support that had kept her going when the diagnosis felt like a death sentence. But then, 6 weeks ago, Thomas had passed away suddenly, his massive heart unable to withstand the stress of running a global empire. His death had left Rachel reeling. She had barely begun to process her grief when she found herself alone once more, this time in a hospital room, with Ethan's empty promises echoing in her ears. Rachel stared out the window, her mind racing. She thought of her father's voice, always so steady and reassuring. "Don't let the world make you bitter," he had told her once. "Even when it hurts, you must hold on to what makes you Rachel." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from a rising determination. She refused to let Ethan's betrayal define the end of her story. She had survived cancer treatments and the loss of her father. She could survive this too. Somewhere, deep within her, the embers of her former self still glowed. With trembling fingers, Rachel picked up her pencil and began to draw. The lines were faint at first, but as the image took shape, her strokes grew bolder, more confident. She sketched a woman standing at the edge of a storm-tossed sea, her hair wild, her gaze fierce. The waves threatened to engulf her, But she stood tall, unyielding. Rachel's chest tightened as she finished the piece. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a declaration. For so long, she had defined herself by her relationships, with her father, with Ethan. But now she realized it was time to define herself by something greater, her own resilience. As the sun dipped below the London skyline, casting the room in a soft golden glow, Rachel set the sketch aside and leaned back against the pillows. She was still weak, still unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Tomorrow, she thought, I'll start again. The leather interior of Ethan Moore's sleek black Jaguar felt colder than usual as he navigated the familiar streets of London. The city's timeless charm, with its cobblestone paths and Victorian facades, did little to lift the weight pressing on his chest. He ignored the calls from his assistant, Olivia Sue, letting his Bluetooth system silence the persistent beeping. His thoughts churned, restless and chaotic, as he steered towards Blythe Manor. The news had come as a shock. Thomas Blythe, Rachel's father and one of the most influential businessmen in the country, had died of a heart attack. Ethan had barely processed the loss, but the implications of Thomas's passing had ignited a spark of anticipation within him. He wasn't proud of the way his mind had shifted so quickly to business, but practicality was, after all, his strongest trait. Thomas's estate was massive, a sprawling empire of investments, properties, and lucrative shares. Ethan had always assumed he would play a significant role in its distribution. As Thomas's only son-in-law and a trusted business partner in several ventures, Ethan had positioned himself perfectly, or so he thought. Pulling into the circular driveway of the Blythe family's Kensington estate, Ethan noticed the crowd of sleek black cars and luxury sedans already parked. The reading of Thomas's will was an exclusive affair, attended only by immediate family and a handful of legal representatives. The atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken tension as Ethan stepped inside the grand foyer, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The house, once filled with Thomas's booming laughter and the scent of Rachel's paints, now felt sterile and unfamiliar. Ethan's eyes swept over the gathered faces, pausing briefly on Emily Blythe, Rachel's younger sister, who stood by the fireplace with a glass of wine. She shot him a cold, disdainful glance before returning to her conversation. Emily had never liked Ethan, but he had always brushed it off as jealousy or immaturity. Today, her hostility felt sharper, more pointed. The murmurs ceased as the family lawyer, a silver-haired man named Alfred Graham, entered the room carrying a thick leather-bound folder. He set it on the polished oak table and cleared his throat, his solemn demeanor silencing the room. "Thank you all for coming," Alfred began, his voice steady. Thomas Blythe was not just a titan in business, but a deeply principled man who cared deeply for his family. His wishes, as outlined in this will, reflect his values and vision for the future. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocking as he focused intently on the lawyer's every word. Alfred began reading the document, detailing charitable donations, provisions for Emily, and instructions regarding the Blythe Family Foundation. Ethan's anticipation grew as the reading continued, his mind already spinning with ideas on how to leverage his inheritance. Finally, Alfred paused, adjusting his glasses as he reached the section concerning Rachel. "To my daughter Rachel Blythe Moore," he read, "I leave the entirety of my personal estate, including Blythe Manor and all associated assets. However, these are contingent upon one condition." Ethan's brow furrowed. Condition? He exchanged a confused glance with one of the other attendees, but remained silent. Alfred continued, his tone unyielding. "Rachel's husband, Ethan Moore, shall inherit a portion of the estate's liquid assets and shares in Blythe Industries on the condition that he fulfills the following: He must personally care for Rachel in her time of illness until her final breath. This task is non-negotiable and cannot be delegated. The room fell into stunned silence. Emily's lips curled into a faint smirk, but Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharper than intended. Alfred looked up from the will, his expression calm but firm. "Mr. Moore, the terms are explicit. Should you refuse to comply, your portion of the inheritance will be forfeit and instead allocated to several charitable foundations named in Mr. Blythe's directive." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd," he exclaimed. "How am I supposed to—" "Sit down, Ethan," Emily interrupted, her tone icy. "Or leave. No one here will miss you." His fists clenched, but he forced himself to sit, his mind racing. Care for Rachel. He could barely manage the guilt from leaving her this morning, let alone endure the grueling demands of caretaking. Yet the stakes were high. Thomas's estate represented more than wealth. It was Ethan's gateway to the upper echelons of power. The thought of losing it all was unthinkable. Alfred cleared his throat again, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Moore, I suggest you take time to consider your decision. The terms are legally binding, and contesting them would be challenging, to say the least." Ethan nodded stiffly, unable to muster a response. His carefully constructed world was unraveling before his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt truly cornered. As the meeting concluded and the room emptied, Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed on the folder that contained his late father-in-law's final words. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the grand windows of Blythe Manor. Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind teetering between anger and desperation. He had always believed himself to be in control, but Thomas Blythe, even in death, had managed to strip him of that illusion. Ethan sat in the back of his car, the rain streaking down the windows as Olivia, his assistant, drove in silence. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was heavy, the tension palpable. His mind raced as Alfred Graham's words replayed relentlessly. The condition set forth by Thomas Blythe was not only absurd, it was a direct attack on his carefully managed existence. Ethan prided himself on his ability to control every facet of his life. Yet here he was, tethered to a decision he had not foreseen. "Ethan," Olivia ventured cautiously, glancing at him through the rearview mirror, "do you want me to contact Mr. Graham? Maybe there's room for negotiation." "No," Ethan snapped, his tone sharper than intended. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, now slightly disheveled. "It's ironclad. That man—" Thomas always had a flair for theatrics. He leaned back, closing his eyes, but peace eluded him. The weight of the ultimatum pressed down on him: care for Rachel or lose everything he had worked for. The audacity of it enraged him, but underneath that anger was an unfamiliar sensation, a flicker of guilt, a shadow of regret for walking out on Rachel earlier that day. By the time they reached his penthouse in Mayfair, Ethan had convinced himself there had to be a way out. He strode through the sleek, minimalist space, the city lights twinkling through floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone buzzed incessantly on the counter, Olivia's efficiency in handling inquiries barely keeping pace with the deluge of calls from reporters and business associates curious about Thomas Blythe's will. Ethan ignored them all. Instead, he called his lawyer, Mark Latimer, a man as ruthless and calculating as Ethan himself. Within moments, Mark's gravelly voice filled the room. "Ethan, I've read the terms. It's watertight. Whoever drafted this was meticulous." "Don't give me that, Mark," Ethan retorted, pacing the room. "There's always a loophole. Find it." Mark sighed, the sound of papers rustling in the background. Even if there was one, it wouldn't change public perception. The media will eat this up. The noble billionaire leaving his fortune to charity unless his daughter is cared for by her estranged husband. It's a PR nightmare if you walk away. Ethan slammed his fist onto the counter, the sound echoing through the empty space. Then what do you suggest? That I suddenly become Florence Nightingale? Mark chuckled dryly. You don't have much of a choice, do you? My advice? Play the role. At least until you figure out an exit strategy. The call ended, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. The rain had stopped, and the city outside seemed to glitter with a cruel indifference to his turmoil. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid burning his throat as he swallowed. Mark's suggestion was repulsive but pragmatic. Pretending to care for Rachel, at least temporarily, could buy him time. Yet the thought of returning to her bedside filled him with unease. Ethan wasn't heartless, but he had long buried whatever tenderness he might have once felt for Rachel. Theirs had been a union of convenience, a blending of ambition and artistry that had started as love, but eroded into mutual indifference. He had always told himself that walking away was inevitable, a survival tactic, not an act of cruelty. His reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a courier. The envelope he handed over bore the seal of Blythe and Graham Legal Services. Ethan opened it with a grimace, expecting more bad news. Instead, he found a handwritten letter, its elegant script unmistakable. Ethan, if you're reading this, I've already gone. I won't waste words defending my decision, for it is a decision born not out of spite, but out of love for my daughter. Rachel is stronger than you realize, but she deserves a partner, not an observer. If you can rise to the occasion, you may find that this burden is not as heavy as it seems. You've built an empire, but empires crumble without a soul. This is your chance to prove you have one. Thomas Blythe. The letter fell from Ethan's hands. Thomas's words cut deeper than he anticipated, stirring something in him he couldn't quite name. The old man had always been a looming figure, both a benefactor and a judge of Ethan's character. Even in death, Thomas had managed to maneuver him into a corner. For the first time that day, Ethan allowed himself to sit with the enormity of the situation. He pictured Rachel, frail but defiant, her green eyes piercing even as her body betrayed her. Could he face her again after abandoning her? Could he muster the humility to take on a role he felt utterly unprepared for? As dawn began to break, Ethan made his decision, not out of love or duty, but out of sheer determination to preserve his empire. If Thomas Blythe wanted him to play the devoted husband, he would. But Ethan vowed that he would do so on his own terms, carefully calculating every move. The stakes were too high for him to fail. The early afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Blythe law firm's office, casting long shadows over the polished mahogany conference table. Ethan Moore sat stiffly in one of the leather chairs, his usual confidence replaced by a simmering frustration. Across the table, Alfred Graham adjusted his glasses, his composed demeanor only aggravating Ethan further. "I've reviewed the terms again," Alfred began, his voice measured. "There is no ambiguity, Mr. Moore. The estate's conditions are legally binding. If you wish to inherit your portion, you must fulfill the requirement." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "You can't honestly expect me to drop everything and play nursemaid," he snapped. This is manipulation." "It is Mr. Blythe's final wish," Alfred replied calmly, "and as his legal counsel, I'm obligated to ensure it is honored." Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. He had spent the past 24 hours vacillating between denial and indignation. Now, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The estate, his future, hung precariously on one unthinkable condition. He had to return to Rachel. The thought of facing her again filled him with unease. He had walked out of that hospital room, leaving her frail and heartbroken, without a backward glance. Yet now, it seemed fate, or Thomas Blythe, was forcing him to confront the very thing he had avoided. "Is there anything else I should know?" Ethan asked curtly, his voice laced with bitterness. Alfred hesitated for a moment before sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Mr. Blythe instructed that this letter be read to you in the presence of the other beneficiaries. It is a posthumous message intended to provide context." Ethan stared at the envelope, his pulse quickening. "And you waited until now to tell me?" "It was necessary to ensure your understanding of the legalities first," Alfred said. The door to the conference room opened then, and Emily Blythe entered, her heels clicking against the floor with a deliberate rhythm. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her place in the world, Thomas Blythe's favored child. Her disdain for Ethan was evident in the tight smile she gave him. "Finally," she said, taking her seat across from him. "I was wondering how long it would take for you to comprehend what the rest of us already know." Ethan shot her a withering look. "And what is that, Emily?" "That you don't belong here," she replied, her tone icy. "This estate isn't something you can manipulate your way into. My father saw through you, even if Rachel didn't." Alfred cleared his throat, cutting through the tension. "If I may, let us proceed with the letter." He broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the crisp parchment. As he began to read, the room fell silent. "Ethan," Alfred began, his voice steady, "you have always been a man of ambition. I admired that in you once, but over the years I have come to see that ambition without purpose is hollow. You have built a life around success, but success without humanity is fleeting. My daughter's illness has revealed not only her strength, but your weakness." Ethan stiffened in his chair, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and shame. "Rachel deserves more than a partner in title. She deserves someone who will stand by her, even in the darkest moments. I gave you this condition not out of cruelty, but to offer you an opportunity. You see, Ethan, it is not Rachel who needs saving, it is you." The weight of the words hung in the air, pressing down on Ethan like a heavy stone. Emily's smirk deepened as she watched him squirm, her satisfaction thinly veiled. Alfred folded the letter neatly and placed it back into the envelope. "As you can see, Mr. Blythe's intentions were clear." Ethan's mind raced. The letter felt like a public flogging, a scathing critique of everything he had built his life upon. Yet it was not the condemnation that unsettled him most. It was the faint glimmer of truth he couldn't entirely dismiss. Emily rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and poised. "If you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make for the memorial service. Unlike some people, I still have a family to honor." Her words stung, but Ethan refused to rise to her bait. He remained seated, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair as she exited the room, leaving a faint trail of expensive perfume in her wake. Alfred stood, collecting his papers. "Take some time, Mr. Moore. This decision is not one to be made lightly." Ethan didn't respond as Alfred left the room. He sat alone, staring at the empty chair where Thomas Blythe once sat during family gatherings. His mind churned with conflicting thoughts, his anger at being manipulated, his fear of facing Rachel, and an uncomfortable curiosity about whether Thomas's words held merit. As the rain began to patter against the windows once more, Ethan made a silent vow. He would play this game, because that's what it was, a game, and Ethan Moore never lost. The grand, ivy-covered gates of Blythe Manor creaked open as Ethan Moore's car rolled up the long gravel driveway. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped through even the thickest coat, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the prospect of what awaited him inside. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, as though holding it might keep his resolve intact. The manor loomed ahead, its stone facade imposing and timeless. This place had always unnerved him, even when Thomas Blythe was alive. Now, the weight of its history and his newly assigned role within it felt almost suffocating. Ethan had returned, not as a welcomed son-in-law, but as a reluctant caretaker bound by a condition he still struggled to accept. When the car stopped, a uniformed staff member approached to open the door. Ethan stepped out, his shoes crunching on the gravel. He adjusted his scarf, shielding himself from the biting wind as he approached the entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing Margaret, the manor's longtime housekeeper. "Mr. Moore," Margaret greeted, her tone cordial but clipped. She had known Ethan for years, but her expression now carried a hint of skepticism. "Mrs. Moore is resting in the West Wing. Shall I have her informed of your arrival?" "No need," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I'll go to her myself." Margaret nodded, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment too long. Ethan could feel her judgment, unspoken but palpable. He pushed past it, stepping into the warm, dimly lit foyer. The smell of polished wood and aged leather filled the air, a scent he associated with Thomas's overbearing presence. Now, it was just another reminder of the man who had orchestrated this ordeal. Ethan made his way to the West Wing, the echoes of his footsteps following him down the long corridor. The walls were adorned with portraits of the Blythe family, their stoic faces seeming to watch his every move. He stopped briefly at one painting, Rachel, painted on their wedding day. Her youthful smile radiated a joy he hadn't seen in years, and it hit him harder than he anticipated. Gathering himself, Ethan continued to the room at the end of the hall. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. For a fleeting moment, he considered turning back, leaving the manor altogether, but the memory of Alfred Graham's firm words and the ever-looming threat of losing his inheritance compelled him forward. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a room filled with soft light from a crackling fireplace. Rachel sat by the window, wrapped in a thick shawl, her frame almost swallowed by the oversized armchair. Her head turned slowly at the sound of the door, and her eyes widened when they met his. "Ethan," she said, her voice faint but laced with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Rachel," he began, his tone measured, "I've come back." Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, her gaze searched his face, as though trying to determine if he was real or some apparition conjured by her weary mind. "I heard about the will," Rachel said at last, her voice tinged with both bitterness and resignation. "It's not like my father to leave things simple." Ethan flinched inwardly at her directness. "Thomas believed I needed to be here," he said, choosing his words carefully. "For you? For me?" Rachel repeated, a faint trace of a bitter smile on her lips. "Or for the estate?" Her words stung, though he knew they were deserved. "I won't lie," he admitted, sitting on the edge of a nearby chair. "This isn't how I planned things, but I'm here now, Rachel. Whatever my reasons, I intend to stay." The room fell silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Rachel looked away, her hands tightening around the edges of her shawl. Her once lustrous hair was now thinner, and her pale skin bore the marks of her battle with cancer. Yet despite her frailty, there was a quiet strength in her demeanor that unnerved Ethan. "I don't need you to stay out of pity, Ethan," Rachel said finally. "I've gotten used to doing things on my own. You made sure of that." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I know I failed you. I know leaving was unforgivable. But things are different now." "Are they?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. "Or are you just playing the role my father wrote for you?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. Rachel's gaze returned to him, sharp and unyielding despite the fatigue etched into her features. "I don't need a savior," she continued, her voice steady. "If you're going to stay, Ethan, do it because you want to, not because you're being forced to." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar ache in his chest. He had come to Blythe Manor with one goal: to fulfill the will's conditions and secure his inheritance. But now, faced with Rachel's quiet defiance, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected: doubt. "I'll prove it to you," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Rachel looked at him for a long moment before nodding faintly. "We'll see." As Ethan left the room, the weight of her words followed him. For the first time in years, he felt the cracks in his own resolve and the faintest glimmer of something unfamiliar: hope. The days at Blythe Manor passed with a quiet heaviness that neither Ethan nor Rachel could fully ignore. Ethan had spent the better part of his first week reacquainting himself with the estate's sprawling grounds and meticulously organized staff. He was careful to keep his interactions with Rachel polite yet brief, aware of the unspoken tension lingering between them. One morning, Margaret found Ethan in the library, his nose buried in the pages of one of Thomas Blythe's numerous ledgers. The grand room smelled faintly of aged leather and ink, its towering bookshelves casting long shadows in the early light. Margaret approached with her usual air of discretion. "Mrs. Moore will need assistance today," she informed him, her tone measured but firm. "The doctor's coming to check her progress, and she asked if you could accompany her." Ethan looked up, his brows furrowing. "She asked for me." "She did," Margaret replied, her expression giving away little. Ethan hesitated before closing the ledger. "I'll be there." Later that morning, he knocked lightly on the door to Rachel's room. When she called for him to enter, he found her sitting by the window again, her shawl draped over her shoulders. A vase of fresh daisies rested on the table beside her, a touch of cheer amid the subdued decor. "Margaret said you needed me," Ethan began, his voice steady but soft. Rachel looked up, her green eyes shadowed by exhaustion. "I thought it might help," she admitted, gesturing to the chair beside her. "The doctor said it's good to have support." Ethan nodded and took the seat, the space between them feeling both vast and suffocating. Moments later, Dr. Hazelman, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, entered the room. He carried a leather medical bag and exuded a calm professionalism. As the doctor examined Rachel, Ethan found himself watching her more closely than he had in years. The way her hands fidgeted with the edges of her shawl, the slight tremor in her voice as she answered Dr. Hazelman's questions. It all painted a picture of a woman far removed from the vibrant artist he had married. Yet, amidst her fragility, there was a quiet determination that struck him. "Her vitals are stable," Dr. Hazelman said after completing his examination. "But the fatigue and nausea may persist. The treatments take a toll, as you know." Rachel gave a faint nod, her expression unreadable. Ethan glanced at her, unsure of what to say. "You're doing well, Rachel," the doctor continued gently. "Your strength is remarkable." When Dr. Hazelman left, Rachel leaned back in her chair, her weariness more evident now. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her vulnerability in the silence that followed. "Thank you for being here," Rachel said at last, her voice quiet. "I know this isn't easy for you." "It's not about me," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his tone. She gave a weak smile. "No, it's not." For the rest of the day, Ethan found himself grappling with an unfamiliar unease. Rachel's resilience, her ability to face her illness with grace, unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He spent the afternoon in the study, staring at papers he couldn't focus on. By evening, the manor had settled into its usual stillness. Ethan wandered into the kitchen, hoping to find some distraction. Instead, he encountered Margaret preparing tea. She raised an eyebrow at him, clearly unaccustomed to his presence in that part of the house. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice neutral. "No," Ethan admitted. After a pause, he added, "Margaret, do you think she resents me?" The housekeeper's hands stilled, her gaze thoughtful. "Mrs. Moore is not one to dwell on resentment," she said carefully, "but she does expect honesty. Mr. Moore, if you're here, truly here, she'll know." Ethan nodded, unsure of how to respond. He carried the tea tray upstairs, knocking gently on Rachel's door before entering. She looked up from a sketch pad resting on her lap, surprised to see him. "I thought you might like some tea," he said, setting the tray down on the small table near her chair. Rachel regarded him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." He poured her a cup, his movements careful. As she sipped the tea, Ethan noticed the faint lines of a sketch emerging on the paper. It depicted the manor's gardens, though the lines were softer, more dreamlike than the stark reality outside. "You're drawing again," he remarked, his voice light. Rachel glanced at the sketch. "It helps," she said simply. Ethan sat in the chair opposite her, the silence between them less strained now. For the first time in years, they shared a moment of quiet companionship, unspoken but tangible. As he left her room that night, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, guilt, curiosity, and something he couldn't quite name. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he wondered if perhaps there was more to this journey than fulfilling a condition. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of dew as sunlight poured through the tall windows of Blythe Manor's dining room. Ethan sat at the long oak table, his coffee untouched, his thoughts elsewhere. The routine at the manor was slowly settling into his life, though it felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. He had started spending more time near Rachel's room, ostensibly to check on her, but more often simply lingering nearby, unable to name the emotions tying him to her presence. His contemplation was interrupted by Margaret, who appeared in the doorway, her expression neutral, but her tone expectant. "Mrs. Moore has a visitor," she said. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Who?" "A Mr. Michael Aldridge," Margaret replied. "An old friend of Mrs. Moore, I believe." The name struck a chord. Michael Aldridge had been one of Rachel's closest friends during her early days in the London art scene. Ethan remembered him vaguely, a man whose easy charm and warmth had always been a quiet irritant. Michael had been present at their wedding, a shadow among the other guests, but Ethan had rarely thought of him since. "Where is he now?" Ethan asked, rising. "In the west parlour with Mrs. Moore," Margaret said. "Shall I bring tea for them?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, and bring a third cup." Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing, disappearing toward the kitchen. Ethan adjusted his shirt cuffs and strode toward the parlour. He wasn't sure why, but the idea of Michael's presence unsettled him. As he approached, the low hum of conversation became audible. Rachel's voice, soft but tinged with laughter, carried through the slightly ajar door. Ethan paused for a moment, his hand hovering near the doorknob. It had been a long time since he had heard her laugh, longer than he cared to admit. He pushed the door open, stepping inside. Rachel and Michael sat near the large bay window, bathed in golden light. Michael, with his sandy hair and boyish grin, looked exactly as Ethan remembered. Rachel's expression softened when she saw Ethan, though her eyes flicked between him and Michael with a flicker of unease. "Ethan," Rachel said, her voice polite, "you remember Michael, don't you?" "Of course," Ethan replied smoothly, offering a faint smile. It's been years. Michael rose, extending a hand. Ethan, good to see you again. Ethan shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the genuine warmth in Michael's demeanor. Likewise, he said, though the words felt hollow. Margaret entered then with the tea tray, placing it on the small table near the window. The air between the three of them was cordial but thick with unspoken tension. So, Ethan began, pouring himself a cup of tea. What brings you here, Michael? Michael leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. I was in town for an exhibition. When I heard about Rachel's illness, I thought I'd visit. It's been far too long. Rachel glanced at Michael, her expression softening again. Michael's been busy building his gallery in Notting Hill. He's been showcasing some incredible artists. And you, Michael added, turning to Rachel with an admiring smile. You've always had an eye for talent. The community misses your presence, you know. Ethan sipped his tea, his jaw tightening as he watched their interaction. It wasn't overt, but there was a familiarity between them that stung more than he cared to admit. I suppose the art world has changed quite a bit, Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral. Michael nodded. It has, but Rachel's name still carries weight. She was a force in her time. I'm sitting right here, Rachel interjected lightly, a teasing smile on her lips. No need to talk about me as if I'm some relic. The comment broke the tension momentarily, drawing a laugh from Michael and even a faint chuckle from Ethan. But as the conversation continued, Ethan found himself feeling increasingly like an outsider. Michael's ease with Rachel, the way he could coax a smile from her with a simple anecdote or compliment, was a sharp contrast to Ethan's own strained attempts to bridge the gap between them. As the afternoon wore on, Michael prepared to leave, promising to visit again soon. At the door, he turned to Rachel, his gaze steady. Take care of yourself, Rachel, and don't hesitate to call if you need anything. Rachel smiled warmly. Thank you, Michael. It means a lot. Ethan watched as Michael left, his departure leaving an almost tangible void in the room. Rachel turned back to Ethan, her expression unreadable. He's a good friend, she said simply, as if sensing Ethan's thoughts. Ethan nodded, though the knot in his chest didn't loosen. He cares about you. Rachel's gaze softened slightly. He does. But so do you, don't you? The question caught Ethan off guard, and for a moment, he couldn't respond. The weight of her words hung in the air, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he could give. Finally, he said, I'm here, Rachel. That has to count for something. She didn't respond, her expression contemplative as she turned toward the window. The golden light of the setting sun bathed her face, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle on him. Whatever the future held, it was becoming increasingly clear that he could no longer avoid the emotional reckoning that loomed ahead. The stillness of Blythe Manor seemed amplified that evening. The muffled sound of wind brushing against the old stone walls, the only audible sign of life. Ethan paced the length of his room, his thoughts heavy and disjointed. The visit from Michael Aldridge had unsettled something deep within him, a discomfort he couldn't quite name. Was it jealousy, or was it the stark realization of how far Rachel had drifted from him, and how easily someone else could fill the void he had left? A soft knock at his door broke his reverie. When he opened it, he found Margaret standing there, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. Mrs. Moore is asking for you, she said simply, her expression neutral, but her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Ethan frowned. Is everything all right? Margaret hesitated before responding. She's been restless since Mr. Aldridge left. She hasn't said much, but she seems unsettled. Ethan nodded, grabbing the cardigan draped over the chair nearby. I'll go. As he walked down the familiar hallways toward Rachel's room, Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that each step brought him closer to a reckoning he wasn't prepared for. When he reached her door, it was slightly ajar, and he knocked lightly before entering. Rachel was sitting in her armchair, her sketchpad abandoned on the small table beside her. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across her face, making her look both ethereal and fragile. She glanced up as he entered, her expression softening. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for coming." He closed the door behind him, moving toward her. "Margaret said you needed me." Rachel nodded faintly, her hands fidgeting with the edges of the blanket draped over her lap. I didn't want to be alone tonight." Ethan hesitated for a moment before pulling a chair closer to hers and sitting down. The room felt smaller now, the air charged with an unspoken tension. Rachel looked at him, her gaze searching, as though trying to decipher something about him she couldn't quite grasp. "Do you ever think about how things might have been?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Rachel looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "I mean us, our life together. Do you ever wonder if it could have been different?" Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I do," he admitted. "More than I care to admit." Rachel nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I used to think we were invincible, that no matter what, we'd always find our way back to each other, but somewhere along the way, we stopped trying, didn't we?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the fire, the dancing flames a reflection of the turmoil in his chest. "I don't know when it happened," he said finally, "but I know I should have fought harder for us, for you." Rachel looked at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You hurt me, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "not just by leaving, but by making me feel like I wasn't enough, like I was just another obstacle in your path." Ethan felt her words like a physical blow. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, his voice low. "I thought walking away would spare us both the pain. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Rachel's gaze softened, though the weight of her pain lingered between them. "I don't want you to stay out of guilt," she said finally. "If you're here because of my father's will, then you're wasting both of our time." Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It started that way," he admitted, "but now I'm not so sure. I see you, Rachel. I see your strength, your resilience, and I can't help but wonder how I could have ever left someone like you." Rachel's lips parted slightly, her expression shifting from disbelief to something softer, more vulnerable. She looked away, her gaze falling on the sketchpad beside her. "I've spent so long trying to be strong," she said, "to prove to myself that I didn't need you. But it's exhausting, Ethan, fighting this battle alone." "You're not alone," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady. "Not anymore." Rachel looked at him again, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Whatever she saw there seemed to calm her, and she nodded faintly. The fire burned lower, its light casting softer shadows now. They sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. For the first time in years, it felt as though the walls between them had begun to crack, allowing the faintest glimmer of something long lost to shine through. The morning light seeped through the lace curtains of Rachel's room, casting soft patterns on the walls. Ethan sat by her bedside, a cup of coffee in his hands, its warmth seeping into his skin. He had taken to spending more time with her, not out of obligation, but something else he couldn't quite name. The quiet moments they shared now felt heavier, infused with meaning that hadn't been there before. Rachel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She turned her head toward Ethan, her gaze softening when she saw him there. "You're up early," she said, her voice still raspy from sleep. He offered a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check on you." She nodded, adjusting the blanket over her lap. "I appreciate that," she said simply, the sincerity in her voice disarming. Ethan had been wrestling with the weight of his decisions for days, but something in her presence made him feel grounded, if only temporarily. He glanced at the small journal resting on the nightstand, its cover worn and edges frayed. He hadn't noticed it before, though it looked as though it had been there for years. Rachel caught his gaze and followed it to the journal. "I started keeping that when I first got sick," she explained, her tone quiet. "It helped process things, I guess." Ethan hesitated, then asked, "May I?" Rachel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Go ahead." He reached for the journal, its leather cover soft under his fingers. As he flipped through the pages, he found himself drawn into her world, a world of pain, hope, and raw vulnerability. Her handwriting, delicate and precise, filled every page, recounting moments of joy, fear, and resilience. One entry caught his eye, dated shortly after her diagnosis. "Ethan has always been ambitious, always looking forward. I wonder if he even sees me anymore. I don't blame him, not entirely. We've both changed, but it hurts to think I'm no longer part of his future." Ethan's chest tightened as he read the words. He looked up at Rachel, who was watching him carefully, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you wanted to know," she replied, her tone steady but tinged with sadness. "Back then, it felt like we were living on different planets." Ethan closed the journal, setting it gently back on the nightstand. "I was selfish," he admitted. "I thought focusing on my work, on building something tangible, was the right thing to do. But I see now how much I missed, how much I failed you." Rachel's gaze softened, though she remained quiet. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want to make it right, Rachel," he said. "I don't know if I can, but I want to try." She gave him a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not about fixing things, Ethan. Some wounds don't heal, but being here now, that's a start." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret entered, carrying a tray with breakfast. "Mrs. Moore, your tea," she said, setting the tray on the small table beside the bed. She glanced at Ethan, her expression neutral but watchful. "Mr. Moore, there's a call for you in the study. They said it's urgent." Ethan frowned but nodded, rising from his chair. "I'll be back," he told Rachel, his voice firm. She nodded, watching him leave before turning her attention to the tray. Margaret lingered for a moment, her gaze flickering between Rachel and the closed door. "He's trying," Margaret said softly, her tone uncharacteristically gentle. Rachel looked up, her eyes searching Margaret's face. "I know," she replied. "But is it enough?" Margaret didn't respond, her expression unreadable as she left the room. In the study, Ethan picked up the phone, his irritation evident. "This is Ethan Moore," he said curtly. The voice on the other end belonged to Mark Latimer, his lawyer. "Ethan, I've reviewed the estate documents again. I thought you should know. There's a clause we hadn't noticed before." Ethan's grip on the receiver tightened. "What kind of clause?" "It stipulates that if you fail to fulfill the conditions of the will, the entirety of the estate will be donated to the Blythe Charitable Trust," Mark explained. "No one else benefits, not even Rachel." Ethan's jaw clenched. "So, you're saying I don't have a choice?" "I'm saying," Mark replied carefully, "that if you walk away, you're not just leaving with nothing. You're leaving Rachel with nothing too." The weight of Mark's words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He set the receiver down without another word, his mind racing. The stakes had never felt higher, and the consequences of his actions loomed larger than ever. As he returned to Rachel's room, his resolve hardened. He didn't know if he could fix the past, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let her down again. The chill of late autumn settled over Blythe Manor like a heavy cloak, seeping into every corner of its grand halls. Ethan stood by the large bay window in the drawing room, staring out at the gardens. The leaves, once a vibrant green, were now brittle and scattered, swept into uneven piles by the wind. The parallels to his own life didn't escape him. Things once beautiful and full of promise now lay fractured, scattered by choices he couldn't undo. Rachel had been unusually quiet that morning. Her energy, already waning, seemed almost non-existent now. Ethan couldn't ignore the growing tension in the house. Even the staff moved more cautiously, their footsteps softer, their voices hushed. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret entered, her expression grave. "Mr. Moore, the legal representatives for the Blythe Charitable Trust have called. They're requesting a meeting regarding the estate's final provisions." Ethan turned, his brows knitting together. "Why now?" Margaret hesitated, her hands clasped tightly. "I believe they've been made aware of Mrs. Moore's declining health." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything else Ethan had faced in weeks. He nodded, his voice tight. "Set up the meeting. I'll handle it." As Margaret left, Ethan sat down, his head in his hands. He couldn't deny the truth. Rachel's condition was worsening. The house itself seemed to echo her fragility, its once vibrant energy now replaced with a suffocating stillness. Hours later, Ethan found himself in Rachel's room. She was seated in her armchair by the fire, a wool blanket draped over her lap. Her face was pale, her features drawn, but her eyes, those green eyes he had fallen in love with so many years ago, still held their quiet determination. "Margaret said you've been pacing the house like a caged animal," Rachel said softly, a faint smile curving her lips. "What's troubling you now?" Ethan took the chair opposite her, his movements slower, more deliberate. "The Blythe Charitable Trust has taken an interest in the estate," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "They're eager to claim what they think will soon be theirs." Rachel looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "They're not wrong, are they?" Ethan stiffened. "Don't talk like that, Rachel." "It's the truth," she replied gently. "We both know it. And honestly, I don't mind. If the estate goes to the trust, at least it will do some good." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You've worked too hard to let everything your father built just disappear. And I can't let that happen, Rachel." "I won't." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Why does it matter so much to you, Ethan? Is it the legacy, the power, or is it something more?" The question unsettled him. He opened his mouth to respond but found no words. Instead, he stood and moved to the window, the garden's barren landscape mirroring his internal chaos. "I don't know," he admitted at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know that I can't lose you." "Not now." Rachel's silence stretched on, and when Ethan finally turned back to her, he saw something in her expression he hadn't expected: compassion. "You're trying, Ethan," she said softly. "And I see that, but trying isn't always enough. Some things are beyond our control." The weight of her words pressed against his chest, but he nodded. "Then tell me what I can do, Rachel. Tell me how to make this right." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Just be here, that's all I need." As the evening wore on, Ethan remained by her side, their silence a tentative truce against the uncertainty of the days ahead. But deep down, he knew that being there wasn't enough, not for him and not for Rachel. He needed to find a way to preserve what little was left of their shared life, to honor the love that had once defined them, even if it was buried beneath years of regret. That night, as the manor settled into its quiet stillness, Ethan found himself alone in the study, poring over the documents Mark Latimer had sent. The will, the trust provisions, the financial reports, they all blurred together, an overwhelming testament to the precariousness of his position. He closed the files, leaning back in his chair. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, the life he had built slipping through his fingers like sand. But as his gaze fell on a framed photograph on the desk, a picture of him and Rachel on their wedding day, both of them laughing, their faces alight with unguarded joy, something shifted. He couldn't undo the past, but he could fight for what was left, not just for the estate or the legacy, but for Rachel, for the woman who had once been his entire world. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of determination that no amount of paperwork or legal battles could extinguish. The sound of Rachel's labored breathing echoed softly in the dimly lit bedroom. Ethan sat in a chair by her side, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on her pale face. The doctor had visited earlier that day, leaving behind more medications and fewer reassurances. The house felt heavy with the unspoken truth that Rachel's time was slipping away faster than anyone dared admit. Ethan's thoughts churned relentlessly, a storm of guilt, determination, and regret. He had spent hours in the study the previous night, combing through Thomas Blythe's extensive estate documents. He had also reached out to several of his business contacts, trying to find a way to delay the charitable trust's looming claim on the Blythe fortune. But none of it mattered in this moment. Here, in the quiet of Rachel's room, the weight of her fragility overshadowed everything else. A knock at the door broke the silence. Margaret entered, carrying a tray with tea and a bowl of clear broth. "She hasn't eaten much today," she said softly, placing the tray on the small table beside Rachel's armchair. Ethan nodded, standing as Margaret prepared to leave. "Thank you, Margaret." She hesitated, her hand lingering on the doorknob. "There's someone downstairs asking for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says it's urgent." "Who is it?" Ethan asked, frowning. "A Mr. Aldridge," Margaret replied, glancing toward Rachel. "He insisted it couldn't wait." Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Rachel, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. "I'll be back," he murmured, more to himself than to her. As he descended the grand staircase, the tension in his chest grew heavier. He found Michael Aldridge waiting in the foyer, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an urgency that immediately set Ethan on edge. "Michael," Ethan said, his tone guarded. "What's this about?" Michael turned, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "I came to see Rachel, but Margaret told me she's resting. I need to speak with you." Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the banister. "Go on." Michael hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Ethan, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but this isn't about you or me. It's about Rachel." "I'm aware of that," Ethan said tersely. "What's your point?" Michael's gaze hardened. "My point is that Rachel deserves more than just your presence. She deserves someone who truly understands what she needs right now." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "And you think that's you?" "I think I've known Rachel long enough to know when she's holding back," Michael replied evenly. "She's putting on a brave face, but she's scared, Ethan. She needs someone to help her face that fear." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm here. I'm doing everything I can to support her. Are you?" Michael asked, his voice rising slightly. "Or are you just here because it's what the will demands?" The words struck a nerve. Ethan pushed off the banister, stepping closer to Michael. "You don't know what I've been through these past weeks," he said, his voice low but heated. "You have no idea what it's like to see someone you care about slipping away." "Then show her," Michael retorted, his voice softer now. "Show her that she matters to you, not because of some legal obligation, but because you still love her." Ethan froze, the accusation hanging in the air like a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. He looked away, his mind racing. Love. The word felt foreign now, its edges blurred by years of neglect and resentment. But deep down, he knew Michael was right. He couldn't keep hiding behind the guise of duty and obligation. After a long moment, Ethan met Michael's gaze. "You've said your piece. Now leave." Michael hesitated, as though considering whether to push further, but finally nodded. "For Rachel's sake, I hope you figure it out." Ethan watched him go, his footsteps echoing through the foyer until the door closed behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of Michael's words. When he returned to Rachel's room, she was awake, her eyes fluttering open as he stepped inside. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sat down beside her, his expression softening. "It doesn't matter," he said. "How are you feeling?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Tired." "But that's nothing new." He reached for the bowl of broth, holding it out to her. "You should try to eat something." She hesitated before taking the bowl, her hands trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. Ethan watched her carefully, the vulnerability in her movements striking a chord deep within him. As she sipped the broth, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Rachel, I need you to know something. I'm not just here because of the will. I'm here because I want to be." She looked at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Do you mean that?" she asked softly. "I do," he said, his gaze steady. "And I'm going to prove it to you." For the first time in weeks, Rachel's smile reached her eyes. It was faint, but it was enough to remind Ethan of the woman she had been, the woman she still was, despite everything. And in that moment, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would not let her face the rest of her journey alone. The wind outside Blythe Manor howled like a restless spirit, rattling the window panes as the night deepened. Ethan sat in the study, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows across the room. His mind churned with the confrontation he'd had with Michael earlier that day, the man's words gnawing at him like an old wound reopened. Yet amidst the turmoil, a sense of clarity was beginning to take root. The documents from Mark Latimer sat on the desk in front of him, their edges worn from hours of study. Ethan's eyes skimmed over the pages again, the numbers and clauses blurring together. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, not just for Rachel's legacy, but for her peace of mind in these final days. He couldn't let her slip away feeling like a burden or an afterthought. She deserved more. A knock at the door startled him, and he looked up to see Margaret standing there, her expression grave. "Mr. Moore, there's someone else here to see you," she said, her voice low. Ethan frowned. "At this hour? Who is it?" Margaret hesitated before stepping aside, revealing a tall man in a tailored suit. His sharp features were partially obscured by the dim light, but there was no mistaking the aura of authority he carried. "I'm James Holloway," the man introduced himself, stepping into the study. "I represent the Blythe Charitable Trust." Ethan's stomach tightened as he stood, his posture rigid. "What brings you here, Mr. Holloway?" James offered a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We've been monitoring the situation with the estate, and it's come to our attention that Mrs. Moore's health is declining more rapidly than anticipated. The trust has a vested interest in ensuring that her wishes are honored, particularly regarding the transfer of assets." Ethan's jaw clenched. Her wishes or the trust's interests? James's smile faltered and his tone turned colder. Let's not pretend, Mr. Moore. The trust was established to safeguard the Blythe family's legacy. Mrs. Moore has no children, and her condition suggests she won't recover. The estate's future lies with us, unless, of course, you fulfill the terms set forth in Thomas Blythe's will. I am fulfilling them, Ethan said sharply. I've been here every day, caring for Rachel. James raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. And yet, there are whispers of dissatisfaction. Her father's intent was clear. She is to be cared for with genuine compassion, not out of obligation or desperation. Ethan felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to remain calm. Rachel's care and well-being are my priority. I won't let the trust or anyone else dictate how I support her. James studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. Very well. But let me be clear. If you fail, the trust will step in, and the estate will be redirected to our control. Consider this your final warning. With that, James turned and left, leaving Ethan alone once more. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to quell the cold knot forming in his chest. Ethan returned to Rachel's room, finding her awake and gazing out the window. The moonlight bathed her face, giving her an ethereal glow despite her frailty. She turned when she heard him enter, her lips curving into a faint smile. Late-night meetings, she teased gently. Ethan managed a small smile, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. Something like that. Rachel tilted her head, studying him. You look troubled. He hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. The trust is circling like vultures, he admitted. They want the estate. They're convinced I'm not doing enough. Rachel's smile faded, and she looked down at her hands. The estate doesn't matter, Ethan. It never did. My father built his legacy, but it doesn't have to define mine. It's not just about the estate, Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. It's about you, and proving to you that I'm here for the right reasons. Rachel's gaze met his, her green eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. I believe you, Ethan, she said quietly, but you can't carry this alone. My father's expectations, the trust's demands, they're not yours to bear. Ethan shook his head, leaning forward. They are, Rachel, because I let you down before. I wasn't there when you needed me most. I can't change the past, but I can fight for the present, for you. Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry. But instead, she reached out, placing her hand over his. Thank you, she whispered, for staying, for trying. Ethan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He nodded, his hand tightening over hers. They sat in silence, the weight of their shared struggles filling the room. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Ethan made a decision. He would not let James Holloway or the Blythe Charitable Trust dictate the terms of Rachel's final days. He would fight, not just for the estate, but for the woman who had shown him what love and resilience truly meant. And this time, he wouldn't let her down. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Blythe Manor, its golden light a stark contrast to the tension brewing inside the grand estate. Ethan paced the length of the library, the faint echo of his footsteps amplifying the storm raging in his mind. He had spent the morning fielding yet another call from James Holloway, who, in his clipped and calculated tone, had implied that Ethan's efforts to care for Rachel were insufficient and that the trust was preparing to escalate its claims. Ethan's frustration was palpable. The trust wasn't just a legal entity, it was a specter looming over every decision he made, every moment he spent with Rachel. They didn't see the nights he sat by her bedside, her hand limp in his as she drifted in and out of fitful sleep. They didn't know the agony of watching her fight for every breath, her once vibrant spirit diminished but not extinguished. To them, she was a clause, a condition. To him, she was Rachel. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of voices down the hall. Frowning, he stepped into the corridor and followed the sound to the sitting room. The door was ajar, and he could hear Rachel's soft voice mingling with another, Emily's. Her younger sister's tone was sharp, cutting through Rachel's calm demeanor like a blade. "You're too forgiving, Rachel," Emily said, her voice rising. "He left you when you needed him most. And now, because of Father's will, he's suddenly here again. Do you really believe he's changed?" Rachel's reply was quiet but firm. "Emily, I know how it looks, but Ethan's trying." Emily scoffed, her frustration evident. Trying isn't enough, Rachel. He abandoned you, and now he's pretending to care because of money." Ethan stepped into the room then, his presence commanding attention. Emily turned to face him, her expression hardening. "Speak of the devil," she said coolly. "Emily," Ethan said, his tone measured, though his jaw tightened. "This isn't the time for accusations." "Oh, isn't it?" she shot back. "Rachel might be too kind to call you out, but I'm not. You don't deserve her forgiveness, Ethan. You never did." "Enough," Rachel said, her voice stronger now, despite her frailty. She looked between the two of them, her gaze steady. "I won't have this argument." "Not now." Emily folded her arms, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "I just don't want you to be hurt again," she said, her voice softening slightly. She turned back to Ethan, her eyes narrowing. "If you let her down this time, I swear—" "I won't," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "I know I've failed Rachel before, but I won't fail her now." Emily didn't reply, but her expression made it clear she wasn't convinced. She turned to Rachel, pressing a kiss to her sister's forehead before leaving the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. Rachel let out a sigh, leaning back in her chair. Ethan crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his hands resting gently on hers. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything. For Emily." Rachel gave him a faint smile. "Emily's protective. She always has been." "She's not wrong, though," Ethan admitted, his voice laced with regret. "I did abandon you, and I've spent every day since I came back trying to make up for it." Rachel studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Do you mean that?" "I do," he said, his voice steady. "You deserve more than I've given you, more than I can ever give you. But I'm here now, Rachel, and I'm not going anywhere." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in days, Ethan saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. Later that evening, Ethan found himself in the study, poring over yet another stack of documents. He was searching for any leverage, any way to protect Rachel's wishes and preserve the estate without the trust intervening. His focus was broken by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway, her expression guarded. "May I come in?" she asked. Ethan nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She remained standing, her arms crossed. "I've been hard on you," she began, her voice reluctant, "but it's only because I don't want Rachel to be hurt again. She's been through enough." "I understand," Ethan said, "and you're right to be protective. I've given you every reason to doubt me." Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. "Just don't make me regret giving you another chance." "You won't," Ethan promised, his voice firm. As Emily left, Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had made mistakes, ones that couldn't be erased. But for Rachel's sake, he would face every challenge, every doubt, and every accusation, because for the first time in years, he knew what he was fighting for, and he wouldn't let anything or anyone stand in his way. The wind had stilled outside Blythe Manor, leaving the night unnervingly quiet. Ethan sat alone in the grand dining room, his fingers tracing the edge of a glass of untouched wine. The tension in the house had grown palpable in the days following Emily's visit and James Holloway's veiled threats. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to shatter the uneasy calm. Ethan had spent the past week fighting on multiple fronts, dealing with the trust's encroachment, Rachel's fragile health, and his own burgeoning sense of inadequacy. Despite his efforts, he felt the weight of every misstep, every missed moment from their shared past, pressing down on him like a relentless tide. But tonight, as he sat in the dimly lit room, an idea began to take form in his mind. It wasn't a perfect plan, and it carried risks, but it was bold and, more importantly, it was necessary. If he could not meet the trust's demands with legal tactics alone, he would need to secure Rachel's legacy another way. He would need to make a statement that no one, not the trust, not James Holloway, could ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe. He turned to see Margaret standing there, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Moore is asking for you," she said simply. Ethan nodded, pushing back his chair. "Thank you, Margaret." When he entered Rachel's room, she was awake, propped up against a stack of pillows. Her sketchpad rested on her lap, the edges of the paper curling slightly from the pressure of her pencil. She looked up as he approached, her eyes softening. "Ethan," she said, her voice faint but steady. "I wasn't sure you'd still be awake." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, sitting down in the chair beside her. He noticed the sketch she was working on, a delicate rendering of the manor's gardens as they had looked in the spring, vibrant and full of life. "That's beautiful," he said, nodding toward the sketch. Rachel smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the pencil marks. "I wanted to remember them this way," she said. "Not as they are now." Ethan felt a pang of sadness at her words. "They'll bloom again," he said softly, "just like they always do." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She set the sketchpad aside, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Ethan, I've been thinking," she began, her tone careful, "about the estate, about my father's legacy." Ethan straightened, his focus sharpening. "What about it?" She looked down, her expression contemplative. "I don't want you to spend your energy fighting battles that don't matter. The trust, the money, it's not worth losing yourself over." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It matters to me, Rachel, not because of the money or the estate, but because it's what your father wanted for you, for us." Rachel's gaze met his, her green eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I appreciate that," she said. "But my father's wishes shouldn't come at the cost of your peace of mind." Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "This isn't just about your father, Rachel. It's about you, and I'm not giving up." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've changed, Ethan." He looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Have I?" She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You've become someone I can believe in again." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I won't let you down, Rachel," he said. "Not this time." The next morning, Ethan set his plan into motion. He called Mark Latimer, outlining his strategy with a precision born of desperation and determination. "We need to act quickly," he said, pacing the study as he spoke. "The trust won't wait, and neither can we." Mark's voice was cautious but supportive. "Are you sure about this? It's a bold move, Ethan." "I'm sure," Ethan replied firmly. "If we don't take control now, we'll lose everything." With Mark's help, Ethan began to mobilize the resources he needed to execute his plan. He reached out to trusted allies, securing agreements and promises of support. He also met with the manor's staff, enlisting their help in preparing for what was to come. Each conversation, each step, brought him closer to his goal. And though the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, Ethan refused to waver. By the time evening fell, the house was buzzing with quiet activity. Margaret oversaw the preparations with her usual efficiency, while Ethan worked tirelessly in the study, coordinating every detail. Rachel, too weak to leave her room, remained unaware of the full scope of his efforts. But Ethan knew that when the time came, she would understand. She had to. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ethan stood by the window of his study, his reflection merging with the darkness outside. He thought of Rachel, of the promise he had made to her all those years ago, to love and protect her, no matter what. He had failed her once, but now he was determined to make things right, whatever it took. The morning at Blythe Manor dawned cold and still, a pale mist rolling over the gardens like a shroud. Ethan woke early, his mind sharp with determination, but heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The house was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of Margaret in the kitchen, her movements precise and purposeful, as always. Rachel's condition had worsened overnight. The doctor's visit the previous evening had confirmed what Ethan feared. Her time was slipping away, faster than anyone had anticipated. She had spent most of the night asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan had sat by her side, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest, his hand resting lightly on hers. The hours had felt both agonizingly long and heartbreakingly fleeting. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains in the study, Ethan stood by the window, gazing out at the frost-covered lawn. The plan he had devised with Mark Latimer was set to unfold that day, a bold and risky move designed to secure the estate and, more importantly, Rachel's peace of mind. But as the time approached, doubts gnawed at the edges of his resolve. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. "Mr. Moore," she said quietly. "The guests are beginning to arrive." Ethan turned, nodding. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll be down shortly." She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Are you certain about this? It's not too late to reconsider?" "I'm certain," Ethan replied, his voice firm but tinged with a hint of weariness. "It's the only way." Margaret nodded and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Ethan straightened his tie, glancing at the mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, wearier, a reflection of the past month's relentless strain. But there was also something else in his expression, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. The sitting room was already filling with people when Ethan descended the grand staircase. Members of the Blythe Charitable Trust, along with a handful of Rachel's close friends and allies, were gathered in clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. James Holloway stood near the fireplace, his sharp gaze scanning the room like a hawk surveying its territory. Ethan entered with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose. All eyes turned to him, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "As you know, we're here to discuss the future of Blythe Manor and the estate. But more importantly, we're here to honor Rachel's wishes." James stepped forward, his expression cool and composed. "And what exactly are those wishes, Mr. Moore? The trust has made its position clear. Without a legitimate heir, the estate should be repurposed for the greater good." Ethan met James's gaze, unflinching. "Rachel is still here, and her wishes matter more than anyone else's. She has a legacy, and it's not for you or the trust to dictate how it's preserved." The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan continued, outlining the plan he and Mark had devised. Through careful negotiation and strategic alliances, Ethan had secured a coalition of stakeholders willing to protect the estate from the trust's control. The Blythe name would remain intact, with Rachel's vision guiding its future. James listened, his expression growing colder with each word. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Moore," he said when Ethan finished. "This plan of yours is ambitious, but it hinges on one thing: Rachel's ability to approve it. And from what I've been told, she's hardly in a position to make such decisions." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "I can speak for myself." The room turned as Rachel appeared in the doorway, supported by Margaret. She was frail, her skin pale and her frame thinner than ever, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. The murmur of surprise rippled through the room as she slowly made her way to the center, every step an act of willpower. "Rachel, you don't have to," Ethan began, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "I do," she said firmly. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of her resolve. She turned to James, her gaze steady. "You think I'm too weak to make decisions about my own legacy, but you're wrong. This estate, this name, it's not just about money or power. It's about people, about the life my father built and the lives it can continue to touch." James opened his mouth to argue, but Rachel didn't give him the chance. "Ethan's plan isn't perfect, but it's mine. And I approve it." The room was silent as her words hung in the air, their finality unmistakable. James's expression darkened, but he remained silent, knowing there was little he could say to counter her. Ethan stepped forward, his hand gently resting on Rachel's shoulder. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her expression softening. "I know," she said simply. The meeting concluded soon after, the trust reluctantly conceding to Rachel's decision. As the guests began to disperse, Ethan remained by Rachel's side, supporting her as they made their way back to her room. When they were alone, Rachel sank into her armchair, her breath shallow but steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for fighting for me, for believing in me." Ethan knelt beside her, his hand clasping hers. "You've always been worth fighting for," he said softly. "I just forgot how to show it." As the night deepened, Ethan stayed by her side, the quiet of the house, a welcome reprieve from the day's battles. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace, not because the fight was over, but because he knew he wasn't fighting alone. The days at Blythe Manor grew shorter as winter approached, the fading sunlight casting an almost ethereal glow over the estate. Inside, the once vibrant halls were subdued, filled with the faint sounds of footsteps and murmured conversations. Rachel's condition had taken a sudden turn, her strength ebbing with each passing hour. Ethan had never felt so helpless, watching her struggle against an illness that seemed to consume her piece by piece. That morning, the doctor had arrived again, his demeanor grim but professional. Ethan stayed in the hallway outside Rachel's room, pacing as he waited for the visit to conclude. The muffled sound of their conversation was a constant reminder of the reality he had been fighting to accept. When the door finally opened, Dr. Hazelman stepped out, his expression unreadable. Ethan stopped mid-stride, his heart pounding. "How is she?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. The doctor sighed, removing his glasses and wiping them with a handkerchief. "Her body is weakening, Ethan. The treatments can only do so much at this stage. It's time to prepare for the inevitable." Ethan's stomach dropped, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He struggled to find his voice. "There has to be something else we can do. Another treatment, another—" "Ethan," Dr. Hazelman interrupted gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What Rachel needs now is comfort and peace. She doesn't need more interventions. She needs you." Ethan nodded numbly, the weight of the doctor's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. As the doctor left, Margaret appeared with a tray of tea, her expression softer than usual. She's asking for you," Margaret said quietly. Ethan inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself before entering Rachel's room. The sight of her lying in bed, her frame frail and her complexion pale, was almost too much to bear. Yet when her eyes met his, there was a spark of warmth that seemed to defy the weakness in her body. "You look like you've been through a battle," Rachel said, her voice faint but tinged with humor. Ethan managed a small smile, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "I feel like it," he admitted. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged slightly, the movement almost imperceptible. "Tired. But I'm still here." The simplicity of her statement struck him, a reminder of the quiet strength that had defined her throughout this ordeal. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his own. "Rachel, Don't," she interrupted, her gaze softening. "You don't have to say anything, just stay." And so he stayed, the hours passing in quiet companionship. Rachel drifted in and out of sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan remained by her side, his thoughts a tangled mess of memories and regrets. He thought of their early years together, the moments of joy and laughter that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. He thought of the distance that had grown between them, the choices that had led them to this moment. As the day turned to evening, Rachel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he replied, immediately leaning closer. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her gaze locking with his. "Something I've been holding on to." His heart raced, a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through him. "What is it?" She hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "When my father wrote his will, I knew about the conditions he included. He told me it was his way of giving you a second chance." Ethan blinked, stunned. "You knew?" Rachel nodded slowly. "I didn't agree with it at first. It felt manipulative. But he believed in you, Ethan. He believed you were capable of being more than the man who walked away." The weight of her words settled over him, a mixture of shame and gratitude surging through him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because I needed to see for myself," she admitted. "I needed to know if you were here for me or for the estate." "And what do you see now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Rachel smiled faintly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I see the man I fell in love with, the man I always believed you could be." Ethan couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. Tears streamed down his face as he pressed her hand to his lips. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything, for leaving, for not being there when you needed me. I'll never forgive myself for that." She reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "I already forgave you," she said simply, "a long time ago." In that moment, the walls Ethan had built around himself came crashing down. The grief, the guilt, the fear, it all poured out, leaving him raw and vulnerable. But in Rachel's eyes, he saw only love and acceptance, a balm for the wounds he had carried for so long. As the night deepened, Ethan stayed by Rachel's side, his hand never leaving hers. The house was quiet, the world outside seemingly holding its breath, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of peace, not because the battle was over, but because he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning light crept reluctantly into Rachel's room, illuminating the delicate lace curtains and casting soft patterns across the walls. Ethan had barely slept, his vigil by Rachel's side uninterrupted. Her breathing had grown more labored during the night, the shallow rise and fall of her chest a painful reminder of how fragile she had become. The faint sound of the wind outside was the only noise, amplifying the oppressive quiet within the room. Margaret entered silently, carrying a tray with tea and a small bowl of oatmeal. She paused when she saw Ethan's haggard expression, her usual stoicism giving way to a rare moment of tenderness. "You should eat something," she said gently, placing the tray on the bedside table. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes never left Rachel's face. Margaret hesitated, then reached out to squeeze his shoulder. "You're doing everything you can." "She knows that," Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as Margaret left. He leaned forward, taking Rachel's hand in his. Her skin was cool to the touch, her fingers limp in his grasp. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't wake. But then her eyes opened, the faintest hint of a smile appearing on her lips. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice weak but filled with warmth. "I'm right here," he said again, squeezing her hand gently. She blinked slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Is it morning?" "It is," he replied. "The sun's out. It's a beautiful day." Rachel nodded faintly, her smile widening just a little. "I always loved mornings," she said, her words halting but deliberate. They felt full of promise. Ethan's throat tightened as he fought back tears. He wanted to say something, anything, that would convey the depth of his feelings, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he leaned closer, resting his forehead against her hand. For a while, they sat in silence, the unspoken connection between them stronger than any words could have been. Then Rachel's voice broke the stillness, soft but insistent. "Ethan, there's something I need you to do for me." "Anything," he said immediately, his voice firm despite the ache in his chest. She looked at him, her green eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Promise me, you won't let the estate consume you. My father's legacy isn't worth losing yourself over." "I promise," he said, his voice steady. "But Rachel, the estate isn't just about your father's legacy. It's about you. Everything I'm doing, it's for you." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Then let it be about something more, something that helps others, that brings hope." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with both love and sorrow. "I'll make sure of it," he said. "I swear." Rachel's gaze softened, and she closed her eyes, her breathing slow but steady. Ethan stayed by her side, his hand never leaving hers. The hours passed in a blur, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. As the day wore on, the house grew quieter, the usual bustle of the staff muted out of respect. Margaret brought Ethan a cup of tea, which he accepted reluctantly, sipping it absently as he kept watch over Rachel. In the late afternoon, Emily arrived, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She embraced Ethan tightly, her usual guarded demeanor giving way to raw emotion. "How is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She's resting," Ethan replied, "but it won't be long." Emily nodded, her expression crumbling as she stepped into Rachel's room. She sat on the opposite side of the bed, taking Rachel's other hand in hers. The sisters exchanged quiet words, their bond unspoken but deeply felt. Ethan watched them, his heart aching at the sight. As evening fell, Rachel stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Ethan and Emily, her gaze filled with a mix of love and gratitude. "You're both here," she said, her voice barely audible. "We're here," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Rachel's eyes flickered between them, a faint smile on her lips. "You two are my greatest blessings," she said. "Promise me you'll take care of each other." "We promise," Emily said, her voice breaking. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. The room grew still once more, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Rachel's breathing slowed, each breath a struggle. Ethan and Emily held her hands tightly, their silent presence a testament to their love. When the end came, it was quiet and peaceful. Rachel's last breath was barely a whisper, her face serene. Ethan felt his heart shatter, the loss cutting deeper than he had ever imagined. But amidst the pain, there was a sense of peace, a knowing that Rachel had found rest. As the house fell into silence, Ethan stayed by her side, his hand still clasping hers. He had kept his promise, and though the battle was over, his journey was far from finished. The heavy, somber silence of Blythe Manor was punctuated only by the soft creaking of the wooden floorboards under Ethan's feet as he wandered the halls late into the night. Rachel's absence was palpable, a void that seemed to echo in every room, every corner of the house. The walls, once filled with her laughter, her quiet determination, now felt unbearably still. Emily had retired hours ago, retreating to her room after a tearful embrace with Ethan. Margaret had urged Ethan to do the same, offering to ensure the manor remained quiet, but he couldn't. Sleep felt like an impossibility. Instead, he roamed the corridors, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of grief, guilt, and a strange, unfamiliar clarity. He found himself in Rachel's studio, the room untouched since her illness had prevented her from using it. The faint scent of oil paint and turpentine still lingered in the air, mingling with the dust that had settled over her easels and canvases. The light from the moon spilled through the large windows, illuminating her final project, a half-finished painting of the manor's gardens in bloom. The colors, vibrant and full of life, stood in stark contrast to the cold reality of the present. Ethan moved closer, his fingers tracing the edge of the canvas. He could see the precise brushstrokes, the care and attention Rachel had poured into every detail. This was her legacy, not the estate or the wealth, but the beauty she saw in the world, and her relentless desire to capture it, to preserve it. "I don't deserve you," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking as the weight of his grief threatened to crush him. He sank to his knees, his head bowed, the tears he had been holding back finally spilling over. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full depth of his loss. Not just the loss of Rachel, but the loss of the life they had once shared, the dreams they had abandoned, the love he had failed to protect. The grief was all-consuming, a storm that left him gasping for air. But in the midst of the pain, a memory surfaced. He could see Rachel's face, her green eyes shining with quiet determination as she spoke to him during her final days. "Promise me you'll make it about something more. Something that helps others, that brings hope." Her words were a lifeline, pulling him from the depths of his despair. He couldn't let her down, not now, not ever. Wiping his tears, he rose to his feet, his gaze fixed on the unfinished painting. He would honor her memory, not through wealth or possessions, but through action. The next morning, Ethan called a meeting with Mark Latimer. Emily joined them in the study, her expression guarded but curious. The fire crackled in the hearth as Ethan laid out his plan, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm not going to fight the trust anymore," he began, surprising them both. "But I'm not handing over the estate without conditions." Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What are you suggesting?" Ethan took a deep breath. "The estate will be turned into a foundation, one dedicated to supporting artists, providing grants, and preserving Rachel's work. The trust can oversee the financial side, but the mission will be ours." Emily's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "Ethan, are you sure?" He nodded. This was Rachel's vision. She wanted the estate to mean something, to inspire others. "I'm going to make sure that happens." Mark frowned, his skepticism evident. "The trust isn't going to agree to this easily. They'll fight you on it." "Let them," Ethan said firmly. "They can take the money, the titles, whatever they want, but they can't take Rachel's legacy." Emily watched him closely, her expression softening. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of the man Rachel had once fallen in love with, the man who had finally found his purpose. "I'll support you," she said quietly, "whatever it takes." Over the next several days, Ethan threw himself into the work. He reviewed legal documents, drafted proposals, and reached out to Rachel's network of friends and collaborators. Emily stepped in to help, her background in non-profit work proving invaluable. Together, they began to shape the foundation that would bear Rachel's name, a beacon of hope for struggling artists and a testament to the beauty she had brought into the world. The house buzzed with activity as plans took shape, the oppressive stillness of Rachel's absence replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret, ever loyal, managed the day-to-day operations of the manor, ensuring that Ethan and Emily had the space and support they needed. One evening, as Ethan reviewed a stack of grant applications, he paused to glance at the photograph of him and Rachel on their wedding day. Her smile was radiant, her joy infectious. He reached out, his fingers brushing the frame. "I hope I'm making you proud," he whispered. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself returning to Rachel's studio often. He began to work on the unfinished painting, his clumsy brushstrokes a far cry from her masterful technique, but it didn't matter. With every stroke, he felt closer to her, as though she were guiding him, urging him forward. And as the foundation took its first steps toward becoming a reality, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of peace. Rachel's death had left a void that could never be filled, but her life had given him a purpose he was determined to fulfill. For her, for them, for the legacy she had entrusted to him. The rain drizzled lightly against the tall windows of Blythe Manor, creating a rhythm that mirrored the quiet contemplation inside. Ethan sat at Rachel's old desk in her studio, a letter trembling in his hands. It had arrived that morning, the envelope addressed in Rachel's handwriting, a detail that had sent a jolt through him. Margaret had found it among Rachel's belongings, carefully tucked away with instructions to be delivered to him after her passing. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the edges of the paper as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Finally, he unfolded the letter, his heart pounding as he began to read. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to tell you these things myself. I've struggled with how to put my thoughts into words, but I've decided that you deserve to know everything I've held in my heart. When we met, you were my world. I admired your drive, your ambition, and your relentless determination to carve out a life for us. But somewhere along the way, I think we both forgot what truly mattered. I blamed you for a long time, but now I understand. I played my part too. We were so focused on building a future that we forgot to live in the present. Despite everything, Ethan, I never stopped believing in you. I never stopped loving you. Even when you left, I held on to the hope that you would find your way back, not to me, but to yourself. And you did. You came back when it mattered most, and for that, I'll always be grateful. But now, I need to ask one last thing of you. Please don't let my death be the end of your story. Use it as a beginning. Take the love you found again and share it with the world. Build something beautiful, not for my father's legacy or the estate, but for the people who need it most. That is the legacy I want us to leave behind. Thank you for coming back, Ethan. Thank you for trying. Thank you for loving me. Yours always, Rachel." The words blurred as Ethan's vision clouded with tears. He set the letter down gently, his hands trembling as he wiped at his eyes. Rachel's voice echoed in his mind, her words a balm and a call to action all at once. He sat for a long time, staring at the unfinished painting on Rachel's easel. The vibrant colors of the garden seemed to take on a new life under the dim light. She had always seen the beauty in things, even when life was at its most fragile, and now she was asking him to do the same. That evening, Ethan gathered the staff and Emily in the drawing room. The fire crackled softly as they sat together, the atmosphere heavy but hopeful. "I received a letter from Rachel today," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the emotion lingering beneath it. "She left me with a final wish, not for the estate, but for what it could mean to others. She wanted us to build something meaningful, something that would help people." Emily leaned forward, her eyes glistening. "What are you thinking?" Ethan took a deep breath. "We move forward with the foundation, but it won't just be a tribute to Rachel's art. It will be a place where artists from all walks of life can come to find support, to create, to heal. We'll host workshops, fund grants, and preserve her work as an inspiration for generations." Margaret nodded, her usual stoicism replaced with a quiet pride. She would have liked that. Ethan looked at each of them, his resolve growing. "We'll need all of you to make this happen. It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do." Over the next few weeks, the plans for the Rachel Blythe Foundation began to take shape. The estate's main house would be converted into a gallery and residence for artists, while the surrounding grounds would serve as spaces for workshops and exhibitions. The Blythe name, once synonymous with wealth and power, would now stand for creativity and hope. Ethan threw himself into the work, channeling his grief into purpose. He met with architects, curators, and community leaders, forging partnerships that aligned with Rachel's vision. Emily became his fiercest ally, her dedication to her sister's memory evident in every decision she made. Even Margaret, who had spent decades managing the estate, embraced the changes with quiet determination. One day, as Ethan stood in the garden Rachel had loved so much, he felt a strange sense of peace. The flowers, long dormant through the cold months, were beginning to bloom again. The colors were vibrant, full of life, a mirror of the transformation unfolding at the manor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Rachel's letter, unfolding it carefully. As he read her words again, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had given him the chance to become the man she had always believed he could be. And though she was gone, her presence was everywhere, in the work they were doing, in the lives they would touch, in the beauty she had left behind. That evening, as the sun set over Blythe Manor, Ethan sat in Rachel's studio, adding the final touches to her unfinished painting. It would never match her skill, but it didn't need to. It was a collaboration, a testament to their love and the legacy they would share. And as the last rays of light faded from the sky, Ethan felt Rachel's spirit beside him, guiding his hand, reminding him that even in loss, there could be hope. The Rachel Blythe Foundation opened its doors on a crisp spring morning, the air carrying the scent of freshly bloomed daffodils from the gardens. Blythe Manor had undergone a transformation in the months since Rachel's passing. The once grand estate, with its heavy curtains and somber halls, now radiated light and warmth. The walls were adorned with Rachel's artwork, both her finished pieces and the sketches that had been tucked away in her studio drawers. Each corner of the manor seemed to hum with the promise of new beginnings. Ethan stood at the entrance, his hands clasped behind his back as guests began to arrive. Artists, philanthropists, and members of the local community gathered, their voices blending into a symphony of anticipation. Emily stood beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance. She had been instrumental in bringing the foundation to life, her sharp mind and tireless dedication, ensuring that every detail aligned with Rachel's vision. "You did it," Emily said softly, her gaze sweeping over the bustling crowd. "Rachel would be proud." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening at the thought. "We did it," he corrected, his voice heavy with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." As the clock struck 10, Ethan stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. The murmurs quieted as he cleared his throat, his gaze steady, but his heart racing. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying across the garden. "The Rachel Blythe Foundation is more than just a building. It's a tribute to a woman who saw beauty in the world even during its darkest moments. Rachel believed in the power of art to heal, to inspire, and to connect us. Today, we honor her legacy by sharing that belief with others." A round of applause followed, but Ethan barely heard it. His thoughts were with Rachel, the weight of her absence as profound as the impact of her presence. He stepped aside as Emily introduced the foundation's first artist-in-residence, a young painter whose work Rachel had admired. The painter's story of resilience mirrored Rachel's own, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that Rachel's spirit had guided them to this moment. After the ceremony, Ethan wandered through the gallery, his steps slow and deliberate. Guests mingled around him, their voices filled with admiration for Rachel's work. He stopped in front of the unfinished painting she'd been working on before her illness overtook her. He had completed it, though his touch was unmistakably amateur compared to hers, yet somehow it felt complete, a symbol of their shared journey. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "It's beautiful," said Michael Aldridge, stepping up beside him. His tone was softer than Ethan remembered, his usual sharpness replaced with genuine admiration. Ethan nodded, his eyes still on the painting. "It's hers," he said simply. "I just tried to honor it." Michael studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've done more than that. You've honored her in ways most people wouldn't have the courage to." Ethan turned to face him, surprised by the sincerity in Michael's voice. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Michael agreed, "but you did it, and that counts for something." The two men stood in silence, their shared history with Rachel bridging the gap between them. It was a quiet truce, an unspoken understanding that they had both loved her in their own way. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself in Rachel's studio. The room had been preserved as it was, a space for reflection and inspiration. He sat at the desk where she had written her final letter, his fingers brushing the smooth wood. On the windowsill, a small vase held a single yellow rose, its petals bright and full of life. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her usual stern demeanor softened by a faint smile. "It's been a good day," she said. Ethan nodded, his gaze on the rose. "It has. Better than I could have imagined." "She'd be proud," Margaret added, her voice gentle. "I hope so," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope I've done enough." Margaret stepped closer, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "You have, Mr. Moore. You've done more than enough." As the evening light faded, Ethan remained in the studio, the room bathed in the soft glow of twilight. He thought of Rachel's final request, her plea for him to build something meaningful. The foundation was just the beginning, but it felt like the right beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to feel hope. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to fix the past, but the quiet, steady hope of a man finally finding his purpose. Rachel was gone, but her presence lingered in every brushstroke, every corner of the manor. And as Ethan sat there, he realized that her greatest gift wasn't the estate or the foundation. It was the reminder that love, when nurtured, could transcend even the deepest grief. The days after the foundation's opening passed in a blur of meetings and correspondence, but Blythe Manor felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The quiet hum of creativity filled its halls as the first group of resident artists settled in. The air carried the faint scent of oil paints and freshly sharpened pencils, mingling with the distant strains of a piano being played in one of the common rooms. For Ethan, these sounds were a comforting reminder of Rachel's vision. One afternoon, Ethan found himself wandering the gardens. Spring had transformed the grounds into a tapestry of color. the flowers in full bloom, as if to celebrate the new chapter unfolding at the manor. He stopped by the old bench where Rachel had often sat, sketching or simply watching the world go by. The seat was empty now, but her presence lingered in the air, a gentle reminder of the love that had shaped this place. Emily joined him a few moments later, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. "Thought you could use a break," she said, handing him one. "Thanks," Ethan replied, taking a sip. The warmth of the tea was a welcome contrast to the cool breeze. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the garden enveloping them. "You've done something incredible here," Emily said eventually, her voice thoughtful. "It's exactly what Rachel would have wanted." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on a cluster of daffodils swaying gently in the wind. "I just wish she could see it," he said quietly. "See what her vision has become." "She does," Emily replied firmly. "Every piece of this foundation carries her touch. You've made sure of that." They sat in silence again, the weight of shared loss mingling with a sense of quiet accomplishment. For all the pain and challenges they had faced, this moment felt like a victory, not just for the foundation, but for the love that had driven them to create it. That evening, Ethan returned to Rachel's studio. It had become his refuge, a place where he could feel close to her. He sat at the desk, shuffling through the stack of letters and notes that had arrived since the opening. Among them was a card from Michael Aldridge, thanking him for the invitation to the ceremony and expressing admiration for the Foundation's mission. Ethan set it aside, surprised by the genuine tone of Michael's words. As he sifted through the pile, a small envelope caught his eye. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top made his breath catch. Amelia Browning. Rachel had spoken of Amelia often, a young artist whose work had inspired her during the early days of her illness. Amelia had been struggling to find her voice as an artist, and Rachel had seen something in her that few others had. Ethan opened the envelope carefully, unfolding a handwritten letter. "Dear Mr. Moore, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be part of the Rachel Blythe Foundation. When Rachel first reached out to me, I was at a crossroads in my life. Her encouragement gave me the confidence to keep pursuing my art, even when it felt impossible. Being here, surrounded by her work and her vision, has been a transformative experience. I feel like I've finally found my place. Rachel once told me that art has the power to heal, to connect people in ways words never can. She was right. I see her influence in every corner of this foundation, and I know that her spirit lives on through what you've created. With gratitude, Amelia Browning." Ethan set the letter down, his heart heavy but full. Amelia's words were a testament to Rachel's enduring impact, a reminder that her legacy extended far beyond the walls of Blythe Manor. The following day, Ethan visited the gallery wing of the manor. Amelia's work was displayed prominently, her vibrant paintings drawing the attention of visitors and fellow residents alike. Ethan paused in front of one piece in particular, a portrait of Rachel. It was a stunning likeness, capturing not just her features but the essence of her spirit. Her eyes, painted with striking clarity, seemed to look straight at him, filled with the same quiet determination he had always admired. "Amelia has real talent," a voice said behind him. Ethan turned to see Emily, her arms crossed as she studied the painting. Rachel was right to believe in her. "She was right about a lot of things," Ethan replied, his gaze never leaving the portrait. "She saw potential where others didn't." Emily smiled softly. "And now you're doing the same." Ethan didn't reply, but her words stayed with him as he left the gallery. That evening, he wrote to Amelia, thanking her for the portrait and for sharing Rachel's vision with the world. It was a small gesture, but it felt important, a way to continue the cycle of encouragement and inspiration that Rachel had started. As the sun set over the manor, Ethan stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The colors of the flowers were muted in the fading light, but their beauty was no less striking. He thought of Rachel, of the letter she had left him, and the promise he had made to her. In that moment, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The work was far from over, but the foundation had taken its first steps, and Rachel's dream was alive. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to hope. Not just for the foundation, but for his own future, shaped by the love and lessons Rachel had left behind. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of renewal as Ethan stood by the large bay window in the main hall of Blythe Manor. Below, the gardens were ablaze with fiery reds and golds, a stunning display of nature's transition. Inside, the manor hummed with quiet energy. Staff moved about with purpose, artists worked diligently in their studios, and visitors admired Rachel's work in the gallery. The foundation was thriving, yet Ethan felt a sense of quiet reflection as he watched the scene below. Emily entered the hall, holding a steaming cup of coffee, and approached Ethan. "I thought you might need this," she said, handing it to him. "Thanks," Ethan replied, his voice soft as he accepted the cup. He took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. Emily leaned against the windowsill, her gaze following his. "You've been quiet today." Ethan nodded, his expression contemplative. "It's been a year since Rachel passed," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about how much has changed." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding. "She'd be proud of what you've done, Ethan. This foundation is everything she dreamed of, and more." He turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Emily. You've been my rock through all of this." Emily smiled faintly. "Rachel was my sister. Helping you was the least I could do to honor her memory." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the grounds below. The sight of an artist working on a sculpture near the garden caught Ethan's attention. He gestured toward the scene. "Look at that," he said. "Rachel would have loved to see this." "She would have," Emily agreed, "but she's still here in a way. Every piece of this foundation carries her essence." Ethan nodded, his thoughts drifting to the countless letters and stories he had received from artists who had found solace and purpose through the foundation. Each one was a testament to Rachel's enduring impact, a reminder that her legacy extended far beyond her art. That afternoon, Ethan made his way to the foundation's archives, a space dedicated to preserving Rachel's life and work. The room was filled with sketches, letters, and photographs, each item carefully catalogued. He paused in front of a display that held a collection of Rachel's diaries, their leather covers worn but well preserved. One diary in particular caught his eye. Its pages were filled with Rachel's thoughts during the early days of her illness. As Ethan flipped through it, he came across a passage that stopped him in his tracks. "Ethan doesn't see it yet, but he's stronger than he thinks. I believe in him, even when he doesn't believe in himself. I hope that one day he'll understand that love is the greatest legacy we can leave behind." Tears blurred his vision as he closed the diary, holding it tightly to his chest. Rachel's words were a balm to his grief, a reminder of her unwavering faith in him. He sat down at the nearby table, the weight of her love settling over him like a warm embrace. Later that evening, a small gathering was held in the gallery to commemorate the foundation's first anniversary. Staff, artists, and community members came together to celebrate Rachel's legacy and the foundation's success. Ethan stood at the center of the room, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by Rachel's vision. As the evening progressed, Amelia Browning approached him, her face alight with gratitude. "Mr. Moore, I wanted to thank you again," she said. "This place has changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe." Ethan smiled warmly. "It's not me you should thank," he said. Rachel saw something in you. She believed in your talent, and now the world gets to see it too. Amelia's eyes glistened with emotion. Her belief gave me the courage to keep going. And now, being here, I feel like I'm part of something bigger. You are, Ethan replied, his voice steady. We all are. As the evening came to a close, Ethan found himself back in Rachel's studio. He stood before her unfinished painting, the one he had completed months ago. The colors seemed to glow in the dim light, a testament to the love and dedication that had gone into its creation. He spoke aloud, his voice soft but resolute. I hope I've made you proud, Rachel. I hope I've done enough. The quiet of the room felt almost alive, as though Rachel's spirit lingered, offering her silent approval. Ethan closed his eyes, a sense of peace washing over him. Blythe Manor had become more than a home or a gallery. It was a sanctuary, a place where love and creativity intertwined to heal and inspire. And for Ethan, it was a reminder that even in loss, there was the potential for beauty, growth, and connection. As he left the studio, the stars above the manor shone brightly, their light a quiet affirmation that Rachel's legacy was eternal. And for the first time, in a long time, Ethan felt ready to step into the future, carrying her love and vision with him every step of the way. The following weeks brought a strange calm to Ethan's life, the rhythm of the Rachel Blythe Foundation settling into something steady and enduring. The manor's grounds, once quiet and foreboding, now bustled with artists, visitors, and staff, all carrying out Rachel's dream in their own way. Ethan found solace in the patterns of their work, the steady hum of creativity echoing through the halls. One afternoon, as he reviewed a report on the Foundation's growing outreach programs, Margaret appeared in his office doorway. Her expression was neutral, though a glint of curiosity flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Moore," she began, holding an envelope. "This arrived for you." Ethan set his papers aside, taking the envelope from her. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar but elegant, the address marked from a gallery in London. Intrigued, he opened it carefully, pulling out a folded letter and a smaller envelope tucked inside. The letter was from a woman named Sophie Hammond, a gallery curator who had recently discovered one of Rachel's early paintings in a private collection. She detailed how she had come across the piece, its origins linked to a small exhibit Rachel had participated in long before her illness. The painting, Sophie wrote, was breathtaking, its vibrant strokes reminiscent of Rachel's later works, but with a youthful exuberance that set it apart. But what caught Ethan's attention most was Sophie's final note. "Enclosed is something we found tucked behind the canvas. It appears to be a letter Rachel wrote, but never sent. We thought it best to return it to you." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the smaller envelope. The paper inside was yellowed with age, the ink faint but legible. It was addressed not to him, but to Thomas Blythe, Rachel's father. His heart sank as he realized the letter must have been written during a time when their relationship with Thomas had been strained. He began to read, "Dear Father, I know you and I haven't seen eye to eye on many things, but there's something I need you to understand. Art isn't just my passion, it's my purpose. You've always encouraged me to focus on what's practical, what's safe, but art is the only thing that feels real to me. It's how I make sense of the world, how I connect with people. Ethan doesn't always understand it either, but he tries, and that's enough for me. I know you see his ambition as a weakness, but I see it as his strength. He loves me, even if he doesn't always know how to show it. I wish you could see him the way I do, not as someone trying to prove himself, but as someone who truly cares. I'm writing this because I need you to know that my choices are my own. I love you, But I can't live my life trying to meet your expectations. I have to follow my own path, wherever it may lead. Love always, Rachel. Ethan set the letter down, his chest tightening with emotion. Rachel's words were a window into her heart, her struggles, and her unwavering belief in him, even during the most challenging times. She had fought not just for her art, but for their love, despite the doubts that had surrounded them. Margaret, who had lingered quietly in the doorway, spoke softly. "Are you all right, Mr. Moore?" Ethan nodded, though his voice wavered when he replied, "Yes, Margaret." "Thank you." After she left, he sat alone for a long time, the letter still in his hands. Rachel's courage and conviction inspired him anew, her words a reminder of the battles she had fought quietly but fiercely. He thought of Thomas Blythe, a man whose influence had shaped so much of Rachel's life and their own. Yet, despite the distance and misunderstandings, Rachel had never stopped loving her father, just as she had never stopped believing in Ethan. Later that evening, Ethan called Emily into his study and showed her the letter. She read it silently, her expression shifting from surprise to deep reflection. "She really was remarkable," Emily said, her voice filled with admiration. Even when she was struggling, she found a way to see the best in people. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "She did. And now I realize how much of her strength I've relied on. Even now, it feels like she's still guiding me." Emily placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "That's because she is. She's in everything you've done here, everything we've built together." Ethan smiled faintly, her words a comfort. "I want to do something with this letter," he said after a moment. "It feels important, like it's part of her story that hasn't been told." Emily considered this, then nodded. Maybe it could be part of the Foundation's archives. Something that shows how deeply she cared, not just about her art, but about the people in her life. "That's a good idea," Ethan agreed. "It belongs here, with everything else she gave to the world." As the evening wore on, Ethan felt a sense of clarity settle over him. Rachel's letter was more than a relic of the past. It was a bridge between who she had been and who she had helped him become. It was a reminder that love, in all its forms, had the power to endure, to heal, and to inspire. The stars shone brightly over Blythe Manor that night, their light a quiet testament to the enduring legacy of a woman whose love had touched countless lives. And as Ethan prepared to preserve Rachel's letter among the Foundation's treasures, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her story, like her love, would live on. The gallery at Blythe Manor was illuminated by soft golden light as guests filled the space for a special evening. The Foundation was hosting its first major exhibition, a retrospective of Rachel Blythe's work, curated not just as an homage to her talent, but as a celebration of her enduring impact on the world of art and the lives of those she touched. The walls were adorned with her pieces, spanning her early days as a hopeful artist to her final deeply emotional works created during her illness. Ethan stood near the entrance, greeting visitors as they arrived. He was dressed sharply, his usual quiet demeanor bolstered by a sense of pride and purpose. He had worked tirelessly to make this night a reality, and seeing the gallery alive with energy and admiration felt like a dream realized. Among the guests were local artists, supporters of the Foundation, and Rachel's closest friends. Ethan's gaze drifted across the room, his chest tightening as he spotted Amelia Browning standing near one of Rachel's most iconic pieces, a bold, abstract depiction of the Blythe Gardens. Amelia was speaking animatedly to a small group, her passion evident as she described how Rachel's mentorship had shaped her career. Nearby, Emily stood with Michael Aldridge, the two of them sharing a rare moment of camaraderie. Emily caught Ethan's eye and offered him a small smile, the kind that spoke volumes without words. It was a reminder of how far they had come, not just in their shared grief, but in their efforts to honor Rachel's legacy. As the evening progressed, Ethan made his way through the gallery, pausing to speak with guests and share stories about Rachel. Every conversation deepened his understanding of just how profound her influence had been. She had been more than an artist. She had been a connector, someone who brought people together through her work and her unwavering belief in the power of creativity. Toward the end of the evening, Ethan stood before the central piece of the exhibit, Rachel's unfinished painting of the Manor's gardens. He had completed the work after her passing, but it remained a collaboration, a testament to their shared journey. The plaque beside the painting bore an inscription that Ethan had written himself, "For Rachel Blythe, whose vision and love continue to inspire." This work stands as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the beauty found in every moment. As Ethan gazed at the painting, a wave of emotion washed over him. It wasn't just grief or pride. It was a deep, unshakable gratitude for the life they had shared and the path Rachel had set him on. She had given him more than love. She had given him purpose. A voice broke through his thoughts. "It's beautiful," Michael said, stepping up beside him. Ethan turned, nodding. "It was her vision. I just tried to honor it." Michael studied the painting, his expression thoughtful. "You've done more than honor it. You've created something that will outlast all of us." The two men stood in silence for a moment, their shared connection to Rachel bridging the unspoken distance between them. Finally, Michael extended a hand. "She believed in you, Ethan. And tonight, I see why." Ethan accepted the handshake, his grip firm. "Thank you," he said simply. As the evening came to a close, Ethan addressed the guests, his voice steady despite the emotion welling within him. "Tonight is about Rachel," he began, "her art, her vision, and her belief in the power of creativity to bring people together. But it's also about all of you. Each of you carries a piece of her legacy, whether through her work or the lives she touched. Thank you for being here, for keeping her spirit alive." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the gallery with a warmth that seemed to linger long after the last guest had departed. Later, Ethan found himself alone in Rachel's studio, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the energy of the evening. He sat at her desk, a single candle casting flickering shadows across the walls. The letter Rachel had written to her father was still there, now preserved as part of the Foundation's archives. Ethan reached for it, running his fingers over the worn paper. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking, "for everything." As he sat there, a sense of peace settled over him. Rachel's love, her vision, her unwavering belief in him, it was all still here, woven into the very fabric of the Foundation, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to feel the full weight of her gift, not as a burden, but as a blessing. The next morning, the sun rose over Blythe Manor, its light spilling through the windows and illuminating the gallery. The paintings, sketches, and letters seemed to come alive in the golden glow, each piece a testament to Rachel's legacy. And as Ethan stood by the window watching the gardens below, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not for himself, but for Rachel. Her story had become more than just her own. It was a tapestry of love, resilience, and transformation, woven together by the lives she had touched. And though she was gone, her spirit remained, a guiding light for all who stepped through the doors of the Rachel Blythe Foundation. As Ethan turned away from the window, he knew one thing with certainty: Rachel's legacy would endure, not just in the art she left behind, but in the hearts of those who carried her vision forward. And in that, she would always be with him. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.